Hey, it's Brewbird! So you love scotch. Maybe you even dream of opening your own scotch whiskey distillery someday. If so, then I think it's time for a reality check. In this video, we'll be going over the 4 biggest obstacles faced by new scotch whiskey distilleries. I'll be joined by John Fordyce, a co-founder of the Borders Distillery, who will share his experiences as a whiskey startup. So let's go see why whiskey is such a very risky proposition. If you want to get into the Scotch whiskey business, the first thing you'll need is a lot of startup capital to pay for the permits, the distillery site, the equipment, construction of the distillery, and wages for your distillers and other employees. It's unlikely that you, as an individual, will have that amount of money lying around to pay for all these things. In that case, having a solid business plan, lots of industry contacts, and a gift for the gab will come in handy when you start looking for investors to help realize your dream of owning a distillery. You've got the money you need to start your distillery. Now the next thing you'll need is the proper approvals. While getting manufacturing licenses and permits for a whiskey distillery is no different than getting them for a gin or vodka distillery, it's still a very time-consuming process. Let's see how long it took the Borders Distillery to get their permit sorted.
We have 3 sets of approvals in Scotch whisky. We have the rules in law about what Scotch whisky is. So you have to build everything around compliance. Then we have the excise man, HMRC, who regulate whether we can store under bond, manufacture under bond, what the terms and conditions of our business are. And then the third one is environmental regulation, which is very strict in Scotland. Now these 3 sets of regulations are a great help to a new business because you know that everybody's doing the same thing. There's no advantage in a shortcut. In our case, it probably took from initial applications and planning, it probably took 2.5 years.
Until you could start
until we had all the right bits in place, from compliance with the product specification to compliance with the excise legislation and compliance with the environmental legislation.
Gin and vodka distilleries can sell their product almost immediately after it comes off the still. However, to make single malt scotch, the spirit must be stored in a barrel for a minimum of 3 years before it can even be called Scotch whiskey.
I think the real challenge at the end of the day is time. So you get your investment, you make your building, you get your permissions, and then you start manufacturing, and then you just have to wait. And you wait for as long as it takes for the liquid to be ready. Even though you know this is going to happen, nothing quite prepares you for the fact that you do have to wait for such a long time.
Even though it only takes 3 years in the cask for the spirit to legally become Scotch whiskey, that doesn't mean you'll be able to sell your product in 3 years' time. Maturation is not a linear process. It doesn't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, then bang, the Scotch is ready for sale. No, as a Scotch distillery, you'll wait for your single malt Scotch to mature into the best tasting version of itself. Whether that time is 6 years, 8 years, or 10 years of maturation in the cask. You've got to remember that the influences over the liquid maturing in the cask are many and varied. Variables in the maturation process include the quality of the cask, the quality of the spirit, the atmospheric pressure, the relative humidity, and whether it rained a lot or very little during the year. Maturation is a bumpy road, and so it's difficult for a new distillery to fix a time as to when their first spirit will be ready. You'll have no idea. Well, one thing you definitely won't want to do is get impatient and try to rush your whiskey to market when you aren't entirely happy with it. After all, you only get one chance to make a first impression, so you best make sure it's a good one. Well, if your new Scotch distillery has to wait 6 to 10 years before it can launch its single malt Scotch into the marketplace, you'll need to find other ways to bring in money and keep the distillery operational so that you can keep producing spirit and laying down more casks for the future. Let's hear what the Borders Distillery is doing during this time to bring in money.
So we have three different blocks of business. We have welcoming people to the distillery. So we have a shop downstairs, we have a tour. We do our tour slightly differently. It's the distillers that take you around, our team of distillers. So that makes us quite a different, we have a different approach to whiskey tourism. The second business we have is that within our own distillery, because of the way we're configured, we can make other products other than Scotch whiskey. So we launched a gin 2 years ago, William Cares, and we launched on the day before lockdown, Puffing Billy Steam Vodka, which will be relaunched as soon as we're released back into the wild. And then we have a third business, which is we use to build up our international distribution, and that's based around contract manufacturing. So we buy and sell products for our distributors in other countries.
The Borders Distillery also has a cask scheme set up to sell entire casks of their maturing whiskey to private individuals, and they also sell blended whiskeys under their brand name. They have 2 blended whiskeys for sale, the Clan Fraser and the Lower East Side. It's important to note that these whiskeys aren't produced at the distillery. They are made of whiskeys from other distilleries that have been blended to the Borders Distillery's specifications, and so are sold under the distillery's name. While the Borders Distillery has positioned itself as a Scotch whiskey distillery, they are also currently producing vodka and gin. This is a very common thing for new whiskey distilleries to do, to bring in money as they wait for their whiskey to mature. Another common route into whiskey distilling is for distilleries to position themselves as gin distilleries first. After a few years, when they've established their reputation, their product brands, and have stable revenue stream coming in, they'll then start to think about branching into the whiskey business. Distilleries such as the Durham Distillery have taken this approach, as they've established themselves as reputable gin distilleries and are now making the necessary changes to reconfigure their distilleries to also produce whiskey. This method requires less startup capital than if you were to start making whiskey from the get-go. The most difficult part of starting a Scotch whiskey distillery is time. You're creating a product today that won't be ready for sale until about 10 years' time, and you don't even know what that final product will taste like. You're putting out all your money up front and then hoping that it will all pay off in around 10 years' time. If everything goes right, then whiskey isn't such a bad business to be in. But it will take a lot of guts and a lot of faith to start your own Scotch whiskey distillery. I'd like to thank John Fordyce for featuring in this video. Please support the channel by giving this video a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button for more distilling and distillery videos. This is Brewbird, sending good vibes your way. I'll see you next time.